In the current philosophical debate on science and spirituality, mind and consciousness, consciousness or mind and matter, and so on, you will find people using words like consciousness, mind, awareness, feelings, emotions, existence, reality, unconscious, subconscious, unconscious, and all sorts of immaterial, indefinable, and ineffable objects, so to speak, all over the place. And where everyone is taking for granted that we all know what they mean and that by the same word everyone means the same thing. The truth, however, is that the opposite is almost always the case. Even professional philosophers and scientists use these words sometimes interchangeably and synonymously throughout their papers, books, or talks, and only rarely feel the need to explain what each term means to them. It turns out that in most of the cases, when we are dealing with complex issues which more or less entertain metaphysical questions involving concepts that, besides an analytical characterization, also require an introspective ability to determine their nature, people tend to conflate words and meanings, throwing everything and the contrary of everything in the same pot. This sometimes leads to a tremendous conceptual confusion in which everyone is using the same terminology but often means something completely different from what others understand. Therefore, it is necessary first and foremost to clarify the words such as mind, consciousness, and emotions themselves, and what they are supposed to mean, at least in the context of this present course. On the other hand, the history of philosophy has indeed taught us another important lesson. At the beginning of the 20th century, a movement of logical positivism and the philosophy of language tried to pin down knowledge into a rigorously defined set of logical rules and linguistic definitions. However, it failed. This is because when it comes to these evanescent and non-objectifiable entities like consciousness and mind, there is no way, not even in principle, to converge onto a universal acceptable definition. Definitions themselves rely on words that indicate qualitative perceptions of phenomenal and mental content in the first place, and therefore can't tell us anything about it, if not through our own direct experience. One can't define an experience without resorting to terms that presuppose the knowledge of the lived experience itself. In the end, attempting to define consciousness and mind or other subjective experiences using words is akin to defining, for example, water vapor from ice or the molecular structure of H2O in terms of wetness, or milk from cheese. Strict and rigorous mental definitions of first-person experiences that others cannot have direct access to, other than by their own experience, these can't work, not even in principle. This became clear when Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian-British philosopher of the 20th century, pointed out how we can analyze, dissect, and reformulate with words the structure, grammar, and meaning of a word like toothache. However, this will mean nothing to someone who has never had a toothache. If you have a pain, trying to explain this pain to someone who has never had this pain through a scientific, rigorous, or analytic or linguistic analysis will not help much. Someone will always not understand really what it is like to be having that pain if you don't have your first person direct experience of it. In his Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus, Wittgenstein could show how the positivist stream to describe a relationship between the essence of the world and a realist theory of language leads to self-referential paradoxes. Such a theory would have to be so general that it must also encompass itself. Therefore, the best approach to these matters is the good old middle way. We must make an effort to clarify as much as possible the meaning of words, while at the same time avoiding caging them into unique and inflexible definitions. We will focus our attention on consciousness, mind, and emotions. Other expressions and concepts require clarification as well, and we will eventually do that. However, more than anything else, these three concepts, these require being saved from falling into the bottomless pit of an endless confusion that affects the so-called philosophy of minds. And that is already an incorrect expression in itself, if you think about it, because as it assumes that mind and consciousness are synonymous. So, what do we mean by consciousness, mind, and emotions? Are consciousness and mind synonymous or distinct? Are emotions a product of the mind? What about the distinction between the waking consciousness and the sleeping consciousness? And there might be many forms and types of consciousness. Can someone be conscious without being conscious of something? Could be a question. Different people with different cultural and professional backgrounds would answer these questions very differently. For example, most of us, including many professionals, consider what we experience in our waking state as the only meaningful concept of consciousness. Suppose you don't react to an external stimulus from the physical environment. Then you are said to be unconscious. If you sleep, you are considered unconscious. The simple observation that we can be conscious of our dreams and that there is still a subjective and experiential state of existence in a sleeping state, at least in the dream state, does not bother most of us. We don't think about that. And nevertheless, because that's why we say that when we sleep we are unconscious. But that's not entirely correct. We are conscious of something when we dream, even though these might be very fuzzy and confusing dreams. And how do we know that we are truly unconscious in the seemingly unconscious state of deep sleep without dreams, or in the state of general anesthesia? When we wake up, when we wake awake from a deep sleep, it is as if we have experienced nothing, though that's due to memory. It's like when you get blackout drunk and don't remember all the embarrassing stuff you did the night before. One reckons that there are still some experiential images and appearances while you are knocked out, but they simply cannot be recollected. Similarly, we don't remember anything about our life as newborn babies. Then we could say, okay, let's be parsimonious and cut it all out. To believe that we as babies were conscious is an unnecessary hypothesis. But I suspect that mothers would probably disagree. But you know, mothers aren't usually busy with metaphysical ruminations. Usually physicians don't deal with these philosophical questions. These are considered unnecessary hypotheses and distinction that they simply ignore because they do not serve their purpose. And this is also fine in a certain sense. The duty of a physician or doctor is to anesthetize people for surgical intervention, for example, or to wake them up from a coma, not to explain the philosophical subtleties of what consciousness is supposed to be or not. Surgical general anesthesia induces analgesia, that is, it blocks the pain pathways. It avoids voluntary muscle movements, causes, however, also amnesia, and leads to pharmacological paralysis. But we have no idea if and to what extent conscious awareness exists during anesthesia. At least from the philosophical standpoint that searches for deeper truths, defining this amnestic state as unconscious is an unwarranted extrapolation. These definitions make sense as long as such an understanding of consciousness is kept in its proper operational domains, for example, for doctors, surgeons, without having the pretension of being a universal definition that could be extended beyond those boundaries. Regrettably, however, this is what many do. People tend to extend such simplistic notions of waking consciousness as a universal concept without further thought and extrapolate and build their theories and intellectual constructs upon this superficial assumption that consciousness is just what we call the waking consciousness. Fortunately, scientists are slowly becoming aware of this misconception. Modern findings begin to cover up the fallacy. Unresponsiveness and the fading of conscious awareness of the surrounding world, of the physical world, do not denote unconsciousness. Interestingly, in this regard, is the so-called twilight anesthesia. It is an anesthetic technique that sedates patients only mildly and induces amnesia, but no loss of waking consciousness. During this twilight state, they are responsive and can be asked to perform some tasks that they would not be able to recollect after the surgery. This fact alone speaks volumes. The inability to recall events during sedation is no proof of unconsciousness. Others may have a completely different understanding of consciousness. Many equate the concept of consciousness with self-awareness, that is, the ability of humans, together with some other animals like chimpanzees, orangutans, and possibly others, to recognize themselves in a mirror. This is the famous mirror test or self-recognition test, which supposedly demonstrates self-awareness. Interestingly enough, after half a century, scientists still disagree on the meaning of the term self-awareness and what this test truly proves. The American evolutionary psychologist Gordon Gallup, who invented the test in the 1970s, defines it as the ability to become the object of one's own attention. However, much too often you will find specialists in the field more or less explicitly equating it simplistically with consciousness or self-consciousness. Humans are then said to be conscious because they pass the mirror test. They are able to recognize themselves in looking into a mirror. In contrast, cats, dogs, and birds are not self-aware, that is unconscious, because they do not possess the ability to recognize themselves in a mirror. That's at least what some people believe. If one points out that this shows only a bodily self-recognition, and an ability to link the internal awareness of muscles, of the muscle movements, with an image, and that according to this definition, cats, dogs, or birds must be considered unconscious, that is, without sentience, feelings, and inner life, like René Descartes did, who thought they were all automatons, and who held that animals were only machines. Those who adopt such a simplified understanding of consciousness will reply that they don't care about these subtleties. They are dealing only with humans, and the notion of self-awareness serves well as a description of the psychological states they are interested in. Operationally, it works. There is no reason to put things upside down, invoking other conceptions. That is, one again uses the so-called Occam's razor that says, let's use the most parsimonious idea and theory and forget about everything else. But then we could again question, what about children not recognizing themselves in a mirror before the 18th month? Are they unconscious zombies, or simply infants unable to identify their body? And that's where the conceptual problem grows massively. These sort of simplified concepts of consciousness are then taken straightforwardly into the metaphysical domain, where the concept of consciousness assumes an entirely different and much deeper significance. This can obviously lead only to the confusion and misunderstandings we mentioned above. The inappropriate usage of words like consciousness and mind arise not only because of an intellectually slippery way of working with semantics. It relies on the fact that humans do not know themselves. It might be time to recover the good old Greek maxim, know thyself. In school and college, we have been drilled to employ only the intellect and look at everything through the third-person glasses of reason. The human race has lost its innate ability to look inward by a self-inquiring first-person approach. An inward, subjective investigation is even discouraged by the mentalized academic environment, which is regarded as the ultimate arbiter for what should be considered right or wrong, true or false. Children are permanently hammered out of their contemplative state because, so goes the theory, they should not dream and should learn to cope with the real world. We project our inner consciousness and mind, externalizing it into the material world, and have forgotten to rest calmly in ourselves and know ourselves by looking inward. We have even forgotten that we can do that, and when others invite us to do so, we wonder what they are talking about. It is one thing to talk about something material outside of us, say a mountain, a flower, or a starry sky, but it is a completely different thing to talk about the inner objects, so to speak, of awareness, of our inner awareness inside of us. Some types of emotions, usually the most violent and distressing ones, are still in our conventional reach of understanding. We can to some degree relate to them and capture their dynamics and play of forces when they are intense and common enough. However, most of our emotional state is hidden to us. That's why people speak of the subconscious. And yet, a little bit of exercise and an inner movement that goes inward would reveal to us that they are not subconscious at all. We don't notice it. We are not accustomed to paying attention to it. This is not because these things are out of our reach, but rather because our cultural and educational environment doesn't care about and in fact repressed some of the natural faculties we all have. Then, obviously, once we try to dig deeper into ourselves, trying to find out what consciousness and mind are, we can no longer find anything. We forgot how to do it and can relate only to material things outside of ourselves. We can't even conceive what it means to look inside. It sounds only like a play on words to us. The purely analytic empiricist approach has blinded us so much that we have become, so to speak, spiritual analphabets. Schools, society, and jobs have drilled us to develop our minds, but they pay insufficient attention to the development of our inner intuitive and spiritual faculties. Everything has been built on the principles of physical and mental hygiene, but there hasn't been much progress in terms of teaching and learning about ourselves. That's why so many feel the urge to resort to yoga, meditation, or practices of mindfulness and so on. We feel that something vital to our well-being has gone missing, something that our society does not value. In particular, highly developed minds, those who exercise their rational skills to the utmost, got a PhD, and maybe became university professors, are frequently the most inept in going inward by taking a first-person perspective and knowing themselves. Paradoxically, those are precisely the authorities we ask for answers to metaphysical questions. Therefore, we will not adopt a superficial understanding of the word consciousness. We will refer to so-called phenomenal consciousness, and we will describe this later more precisely what this means. And we will take an experiential, self-inquiry, first-person approach towards investigating consciousness, rather than relying on convoluted philosophical or complicated scientific explanations. This is the only serious approach and means to avoid confusion. Knowing directly via first-person investigation what one means by consciousness is independent of authority and our ideological backgrounds. Because asking for the nature of consciousness is first and foremost a matter of experience, not a logical deduction. This is why it appears so mysterious at times. We try to understand the origin of its essence and workings through logical reasoning and external references, while it can be captured only by an introspective first-person approach. Now, having said that, to set the stage, let us first take up the somewhat easier object of our inner knowledge, namely that which goes by the word mind. There is no need to ascribe to the word mind a different meaning than is conventional to do. That is, the cognitive faculty of thought, rational and logical thinking, analytical reasoning, and intellectual discrimination that are proper especially to the human species. Several authors conflate the mind with consciousness or emotions or both. We feel that this is neither useful nor in line with the facts revealed to us by an inner subjective investigation. Just consider your personal experience revealing to you the qualitative difference between thinking about, say, a mathematical problem and being in love. The former is a thought process of the mind, while the latter is an emotional state. You don't need neuroscientific knowledge or logical reasoning to understand that, don't you? One knows this experientially. As a further example, which needs now a bit more introspection, observe how you perceive the thought and the one who perceives that thought as distinct. This is something we have always intimately known but rarely noticed. We somehow experience in ourselves a difference between a thought that appears in our minds for a fleeting moment and the subject that witnesses that thought and that persists after that thought has gone from our, so to speak, screen of apprehension. Again, the former is just a thought, while the latter is an entity, a subject, a state of existence we call just simply I, me, ego, my personality, whatever. We must learn to clearly distinguish between intellectual knowledge and experiential knowledge. In our society, which after the age of enlightenment became increasingly fixed on exclusively intellectual knowledge, experiential knowledge has been downgraded to something irrational and of no value. And yet we should realize we have always known that, but we forgot how it is one thing to have a mental representation of a rainbow in terms of physical science, for example, such as describing how a prism separates light into different bands of wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, while it is another thing to experience the beauty of the rainbow's color spectrum without knowing anything about physics. This is not just the difference between science and poetry. It is also the difference between mind and experience. The former is a mental conceptual and a mental conceptual description of a physical phenomenon with physics, whereas the latter is a subjective qualitative experience in our consciousness where you see colors, a nice rainbow, and that manifests itself following sensory observations. Conflating the two things, that is mind and consciousness, the rational cognition of the mind with the experience of a phenomenon, makes no sense. The two things are ontologically different and cannot be taken as synonymous, no more and no less than we can call an apple a banana. Invoking in this case principles of simplicity or parsimony that should allow us to throw everything into the same pot only underlines our lack of subjective internal discernment. These things appear to be mixed together only to the surface awareness, though by going inward it becomes almost apparent and self-evident how they must be separated. Mind is one thing, consciousness is another thing. That all consciousness can be spoken as mind has become, however, unfortunately, accepted and common malpractice, leading to an endless misinterpretation and confusion. We might summarize a characterization of the mind as follows. The mind, and I would add the limited, finite human mind, is an instrumental entity of consciousness, which, however, is not consciousness. It has a cognitive function of thinking and perceiving. It is the rational intellect that organizes and structures sensory perceptions and translates them into representations, ideas, concepts, and meanings based on symbols, forms, shapes, and numbers. It is the thinking reason that interprets sense perceptions, analyzes data, judges, reflects on concepts, decides, discerns, selects, discriminates, makes a logical inference, and stores its acquired knowledge into memory. It is the intellectual instrument that allows the Homo sapiens, that is our species, to think rationally and logically by an analytic and deductive thought process. So, this does not pretend to be a rigorous definition. In fact, it is not a definition at all. It wants only to be considered a description whose sole intent is to clarify the meaning of the words we are using. It is supposed to serve as a conceptual clarification that should allow us to distinguish the mind from consciousness and emotions, or other objects of our inner field of experience. Now, before we proceed to the characterization of the concept of consciousness, let us briefly digress on the evolutionary aspect of the mind. Frequently, the question that arises in relation to mind, reason, and our intellectual faculties is the following, namely, should we ascribe the same cognitive ability to other non-human animals? We can say for sure that animals don't have the same mental and rational abilities as humans because, for example, well, none of them has been shown to be able to invent the wheel, discover fire, use tools, and let alone build houses, machines, rockets, spaceships, or computers. However, it is also true that animals have mental abilities, though at a lower level and with less practical consequences. Also, animals can learn, make decisions, and especially the more evolved species like dolphins or chimpanzees have remarkable abilities in terms of logical and inferential reasoning. Much less certain is whether we might ascribe a mind to a worm, or a plant, or even a cell, a single cell. We will talk about that. In these cases, we tend to see a purely reactive organism that has no mind, while we will later contend that there is a good reason to conclude how this cannot be entirely correct. But in any case, for the time being, what we will point out here is that a cognitive function like mind and reason cannot be seen as just a block that exists or does not exist, that is on or off. Also, mental faculties can be experienced at different levels of efficiency and quality. In the evolutionary process, the mind has evolved in steps and appears with different gradations. The human mind is the last in appearance in the evolutionary process, but it would contradict the logic of evolution to take human reason as the ultimate tool for understanding reality and the final step in the evolution of cognitive functions, extending it to all reality. It would be a terribly anthropocentric idea, therefore, to put mind, or at least the human mind, at the center of the universe and eventually conceive of a deity that thinks as humans do. The central point we are trying to make here is that the mind, in the sense of the cognitive ability to think rationally and intellectually, is a relatively recent appearance in the evolutionary process of the physical world. It is perhaps the most potent cognitive function that has, at least so far, appeared on this planet. But it should not be universalized and overemphasized, as most rationalists do, mostly being unaware that it contradicts evolutionary principles itself to put mind as the ultimate tool for knowledge. After all, mind is a still simple form of cognition that we should not enthrone to some ultimate form of cognition or universal essence that is supposed to explain everything. That is, the mind is transitional, not final.